Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Food History Happy Hour. As you can tell, today is our special holiday episode. We're going to be talking about all things Christmas and Christmas desserts, and I'm going to be making a vintage eggnog cocktail with a real egg. So, if you are watching, go ahead and say hi in the comments, and I think we can probably get started with our cocktail. I know it's been kind of a while, so I hope everybody's doing well. As you can see, I have my little tabletop Christmas tree up out here on the porch, and we've got our Christmas lights up on the house, so things are getting a little festive here in the Wasberg-Johnson household. Hi Carla, hi Michael, hi Glenn, hi Greg. Thanks everybody for joining. I see some new names, which is great. Hi Liz. Liz and I had a great chat earlier today. And I don't know if Abby is watching. I am going to try my best to talk about Elizabethan food as best I can. Abby made a request. And some of the things we're going to be talking about definitely have their roots in that time period. So, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started with the cocktail. We're doing a cocktail I found. So a lot of historic eggnog recipes, obviously, are designed for a crowd, right? A rather large crowd. I did not want to make a whole punch bowl of eggnog with, pints of liquor and a dozen eggs. It's just me here right now. My husband's working late. Hi, Anna Catherine. So I wanted to see if I could find an individual cocktail recipe. Oh, hi Elizabeth from California. Yes, I don't know if everybody saw, I did post a article from Atlas Obscura about Tom and Jerry. Definitely if you're a thrifter or antiquer like I am, you've probably seen Tom and Jerry, special Tom and Jerry bowls and mugs. My mom actually told me that her aunt and uncle used to have special Tom and Jerry parties. Sorry, that's Sweetie Pie barking. She's expecting her dad home at any moment. So yeah, Tom and Jerry is kind of like hot eggnog. So most eggnog recipes want you to make it in advance and chill it. They call for whipping the egg yolks with the alcohol and then whipping the egg whites separately with either sugar or salt. And then kind of floating them on top. Some of them call for mixing in whipped cream. Hi Annie from North Carolina, friend of Anna Catherine, welcome. But it's just me. And we're in a global pandemic and I'm lazy. So we're gonna do a single serve, one person eggnog recipe that I found in a 1954 cocktail guide called Practical Bar Management by Eddie Clark. And I picked this one in particular because if you've been following the blog, you know that I did a White Christmas menu inspired by the movie White Christmas, which came out in 1954. So I thought we would do that recipe. It's pretty straightforward. This recipe says the drink can be made with either brandy, whiskey, rum, gin, sherry, or port. So, if you've been watching the Food History Happy Hour for a while, you know that I made a brandy flip a while ago with cherry bounce. A flip is another kind of egg-based cocktail. That is just egg and alcohol and sugar. Eggnog is egg and alcohol and sugar and milk. So that's what we're going to be doing tonight. So I have my cocktail shaker. I already put the ice in. And this recipe is not very specific. It says 1 measure of the desired spirit or 1 wine glass of the chosen wine. But I've seen a number of recipes call for 1 ounce of one kind of alcohol and a ½ ounce. Usually a measure or like a jigger or pony. So we're going to make it rich. I'm going to do a jigger, which is 1.5 ounces of spiced rum, and a pony, which is about 1 ounce of of bourbon because I thought I wanted to mix it up a little bit. So we're going American style eggnog, right, with rum and bourbon rather than whiskey. So, like I said, I already have my ice in here. So I'm using dark spiced rum. This happens to be Bacardi. You can use whatever you like. And as you can see, I've commandeered my couch as an extra table because my Christmas tree is taking up a lot of space on this table. But I decided I wanted to move out of the library. Whoops! To keep things festive. That was a little too much bourbon, but that's okay. Glad I brought a little towel. I think the bourbon is a nice ingredient, a nice addition, because I don't know, it just smells more eggnoggy to me. I think anyway. Now, eggnog does call for the use of raw eggs. So, you do, when you use raw eggs, especially not pasteurized eggs, you do risk salmonella. I am taking my life into my own hands with this raw egg. If you don't want to, you don't have to. You can get in some grocery stores pasteurized eggs, although the alcohol does kind of cook them a little bit-ish. Oh, I'm going to put my sugar in. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So we have a jigger of rum, spiced rum, a pony of bourbon. There's already some ice in there. And then the recipe says 1 tablespoonful of sugar, which is about that much. I could have gotten an actual tablespoon, I guess. Just going on the floor. And then the egg. I'm going to try not to get any shell in here. Now, I will tell you, if you are afraid of egg-based cocktails, that's fair. You're allowed to be afraid of egg-based cocktails. But when you shake the egg with alcohol and ice, as I'm about to do, it gets very creamy. It does taste a little bit eggy when you have a full egg with the yolk, but it's pretty delish. And then I have whole milk here. It says in the recipe to add half a tumbler of fresh milk. I have a wine glass for mine because I thought that was more festive. So I'm just going to guesstimate, you know, I don't know, that's probably half a cup. Half a cup or thereabouts of milk. And now, because I have a not very expensive cocktail shaker that has leaked in the past, I am going to wrap it up. Also, it's going to be cold, and we are going to give it a shake. So the longer you shake, the creamier it's probably going to be. I feel like I'm missing also a lot of comments. Which I totally am. I'm sorry the audio is crackly. It might be, it's probably the traffic outside. I live on a very busy road. So that's probably what it is. But anyway. What else am I missing? I might also have a terrible internet connection because that's how we roll. And Catherine, I'm not sure there is such a thing as too much bourbon. I think that's all personal taste. Yeah, I did see a recipe for vegan eggnog that called for silken tofu instead of an egg. So you could try that. I'm not sure I'd recommend it. Okay. All right, this is very, very cold. I hope that's mixed enough. We'll find out. We're gonna see how pretty this looks. It's very frothy. Oh, it's very cold. That looks pretty eggnoggy, people. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to drink this whole thing, you guys. Yeah, okay. So I made more than fits in a wine glass. That's okay. It's going somewhere that's not in front of me. And then la pièce de résistance. Because it's eggnog. We have to have freshly grated nutmeg on top. I have my little microplane here. You've never had freshly grated nutmeg? It's pretty great, actually. It's not to everybody's taste, but I enjoy it. All right. Moment of truth. Is anyone else drinking eggnog at home? If you are, you should say in the comments. This is our, oh, it's already, I don't know if you can see, it's already kind of separated out. There's froth on the top, which is kind of nice. So this is 1954 single serve eggnog. You need ice. I put in a pony of spiced rum, sorry, a jigger of spiced rum, a pony of bourbon, about a half a cup of whole milk, 1 large egg, a tablespoon of sugar, shook it all up over ice, put some nutmeg on top, and now we're gonna taste it. That is not sweet enough. It's not bad actually. It is very alcoholic. The froth on top is very nice. Anna Catherine is drinking Cornell Dairy Eggnog with North Carolina Queen Charlotte rum. So you cheated a little bit and bought prepared eggnog, didn't you? And just put some rum in it. You definitely can do that. Most prepared eggnog is much richer than this. Because this is just whole milk, it's not particularly rich. It does have a nice flavor. I'm glad I mixed the spiced rum and the bourbon. I mean, it maybe could have used a little more sugar. It doesn't taste particularly eggy, surprisingly. But the foam on top is very nice. All right, so that's our single serve 1954 eggnog. Does anyone have any questions about eggnog before we get started? Michael, you could make it with cream. I probably wouldn't use heavy cream, because that is likely to actually whip when you're shaking it. Half and half would probably be okay. That's not going to whip into whipped cream. But if you use actual whipping cream, particularly if you shake it for too long, you might end up with butter. So definitely I would recommend the light cream or the half and half route if you wanted it very rich. But if you're watching calories maybe in consuming your eggnog, this might be a nice alternative. It's very nice. Yeah, it's very nice. I would make it again. Better, I think, than a lot of commercial eggnogs, which I find too sweet and, I don't know, too thick for my taste. Oh, Anna Catherine is asking, do I think the heavy cream would whip with that much booze in it? It's only, you know, max 2 ounces of booze, though. It's not that much. All right, Michael, thank you for reminding me, asking the question, where did eggnog originate? So, the history of eggnog is a little murky, but it definitely, like everything we're going to be talking about tonight, has its origins in medieval Europe, particularly medieval England. Glenn says Carla noticed the flickering window candles. That might be the audio interference. Well, they're electric, so I don't know if that would have audio interference. It's probably just my Wi-Fi signal. It's not that great. And yes, Annie, eggnog is very similar to a flip. So there are a lot of egg-based alcohol beverages that date back to antiquity. It's usually a mixture of eggs and wine. Like a posset is a very early version of eggs and wine. But once we start distilling alcohol, people start to use that brandy primarily as the main distilled alcohol in Europe, in medieval Europe. But the thing about adding eggs and alcohol and shaking them or stirring them or whipping them together is the eggs act as a thickener. So you get like a thicker mouthfeel to your beverage. And they also add calories. right? So there's all kinds of egg-based and egg white-based cocktail recipes that get developed in the 19th century. Eggnog, again, like I said, eggnog specifically where it's eggs and sugar and alcohol and milk or cream. That's what differentiates it from a flip. A flip does not have milk or cream in it. That we think dates back to probably the 16th, 17th century. For sure, by the time you get to the 18th century, it's being consumed on a regular basis in England, and that's, of course, how it gets imported to the Americas. The main change in the Americas is the shift from using primarily brandy to using rum primarily, and then also other American spirits like bourbon, whiskey, things like that. Although according to the 1954 recipe, you can make it with sherry, you can make it with gin. I don't know that a gin eggnog would be very good. Maybe it'll taste more Christmassy because it tastes more like juniper pine. I don't know. I'm kind of afraid to try a gin eggnog. Someone else will have to try one and tell me, but definitely in the United States, the rum bourbon variety is probably more traditional. There is also apocryphally George Washington's eggnog, which according to Mount Vernon, they can't find any actual documentation in the 18th century, which is when George Washington was alive, right? He died in 1799, I believe. They can't find any documentation of a recipe that was used or that it was served in the Washington household while Washington's alive. There's speculation that that apocryphal recipe that's floating around the internet is actually a 19th century creation that was attributed to him. However, if you want to make a cherry bounce flip, as I did, there is George and Martha Washington's original cherry bounce recipe is floating around there. I do have an adapted version on my website, which is what I use to make the flips, thefoodhistorian.com. If you've never visited, go check it out. And then I did also share earlier an article about the Eggnog Riot of West Point, which I think was it 1832? Oh, I'm like so far away from my computer. Hold on. I have to look up the date now, otherwise it's going to bother me. 1826. Okay, 1826 was the Eggnog Riot. So of course, I actually don't live that far from West Point. I'm about 20 minutes north of West Point here in the Hudson Valley. And West Point cadets were not allowed to have alcohol on campus, but during the holiday season, most of the officers were off-site having their own parties. They left the cadets in the care of just a couple of officers, and the cadets, including people like Jefferson Davis and other people who were involved in the American Civil War as adults, got to partying in the barracks. The couple of officers on duty tried to go and break up the parties, and the cadets essentially rioted because they were drunk. But that's why we don't have alcohol on campus, right? So that's a very famous incident in American history involving eggnog. Oh, Anna Catherine asked, is the difference between eggnog and posset that the posset has no egg? I believe the posset, I have to double check. Got out my phone so I don't have to like lean across. I'm pretty sure the difference with eggnog and posset is that posset uses wine, not distilled liquor. And it might not have dairy, but I think it has egg. Let me just check really quick. Because it is hard to keep these drinks straight in your head sometimes because there's so many of them. Oh, you know what? No, you're right. You're right, it doesn't have egg. It does have dairy, it doesn't have egg. So a posset is similar to a syllabub. Now we're getting really like existential here with our drinks. In that you're using wine to curdle the milk or cream, right? So it thickens it right up and often separates out. Although possets could also be made with ale, and syllabub is pretty exclusively made with wine. But if you whip the dairy with the alcohol, and that curdles the milk, like the proteins get separated right from the fats, and it makes a thicker drink. So in the medieval period, a lot of these drinks were being consumed. There's also like versions in the medieval period that are mixing alcohol or wine with grain, like almost like a porridge, or with ale or with wine. And a lot of that has to do with caloric intake, particularly in the winter. So when you don't have central heat, and perhaps you're a poor Oxford student or a poor Oxford professor, right, and you need to consume those extra calories to help you stay warm, beverages were one way that you could do that. And a lot of those beverages, particularly in the evening, which was not the primary meal of the day, those sorts of beverages became a real source of calories for people who were trying to stay warm during the cold winter months. Syllabub is an awesome word, Anna Catherine. I have never made it because, like a lot of eggnog recipes, that's you have to make quite a batch of it. But I have friends, a couple of different friends actually, who make it, and I've tried theirs, and I did not think I would like it, but it's quite fantastic. They're usually much fruitier than eggnog or posset or other of these sorts of drinks because they contain wine and sometimes also fruit juices. So, yeah. Annie is asking about milk punch. Oh my gosh, you guys, I should have done so much more research before this talk. So milk punch is kind of a version of posset, although I'm pretty sure it's largely made with bourbon. Definitely connected, like in Louisiana, there's a lot of New Orleans milk punch is very popular, part of Mardi Gras. All right, yeah, so that one is milk, bourbon, and sugar. Right, again, served cold with nutmeg on top. But that is, again, you're whipping the milk and the alcohol together, and it makes it very creamy and kind of thickens it up. And once you do that, it's not quite shelf stable, but some people strain out the solids out of milk punch, right, because it separates the proteins out of the milk when you add alcohol. So some people strain their milk punch, and then it's not really shelf stable, but you can keep it in the fridge kind of like forever. Because you strained out those solids, and the alcohol and the sugar are acting as a preservative for the milk. So yeah, that's primarily our British heritage as a country. Alcohol and dairy. Very popular mixture in the British Isles and to a lesser extent other parts of Northern Europe, but it's really the Brits who are doing a lot of that mixing. And I actually had a conversation earlier today with Liz all about the tyranny of New England, I call it, this sort of unspoken British infiltration of what's considered American food. And definitely our Christmas traditions play very much into that. Some of them are adopted, some of our Christmas traditions are adopted from other countries, like Christmas trees are from Germany, thanks to Prince Albert, the German prince who married Queen Victoria, right? That was a tradition that started in the Victorian period in England, that was pre-existing in Germany, and then spread to the United States. Hi, Rosemary and John. But a lot of our Christmas traditions, particularly around food, actually date back to medieval England. So I said tonight I was going to talk about some of the lost desserts that used to be associated with Christmas and the holiday season, and most people don't really make them for sure or consume them anymore. And so I thought tonight we would talk about plum pudding, fruitcake, and mincemeat pie. Because what you see today is not usually the original. So, before we get started, does anybody have any questions about any of those things, or any more questions about dairy-based drinks that I will attempt to answer? No. Alright, well, if you think of any, just drop them in the comments. I thought we would start with fruitcake, because fruitcake is infamous in the United States. Anna Catherine actually sent me 2 really wonderful recipes for fruitcake. I have not had time to make them. For a whole bunch of reasons, one of which is that you have to let them cure for a couple of weeks. Oh, wait, Michael has one last question. Is eggnog related to wassail? So there are, let's talk a little bit more about alcohol and Christmas in Britain, because wassail is definitely related. So in medieval England, when you have the introduction of spices and sugar, right, they're quite expensive. There are spices that were known in the Western world dating back to antiquity, including ginger in particular and cinnamon. Other spices, including very infamously nutmeg, were not introduced to Europe until the 16th century in many ways. They did exist prior to that a little bit, but it wasn't really expanded until the Portuguese go to what become known as the Spice Islands and basically cut out the middleman of Arab traders who would come, and Chinese traders who would come along the Silk Road, like overland, right? And Venice was the spice trade hub for Europe, which is part of what allowed the Renaissance to take place, because that's where they were making all of their money, right? These very valuable, easily transportable goods that you could make a lot of money on in Europe. So there started to be a trend among the very wealthy of adding these spices to everything: desserts, alcohols, and wassail is one of them. Mulled wine, particularly with the addition of honey and spices, is quite old. It dates back to antiquity, essentially, and that's basically what wassail is. It's a version of mulled wine. There's also there's a couple of other hot and cold spiced alcoholic beverages that date back to the medieval period, including mulled ale, right, which is a type of beer, and some of the methods for mulling ale included putting a hot poker in a tankard or a flagon of ale, which, when my chimney is clean, I actually want to try that. I'm not a big beer drinker, but I think it would be really fun to stick a hot poker into a mug of ale and see what happens. And then another one, which dates back to the Elizabethan period, possibly earlier, is called lamb's wool, which is where you roast apples by the fire. If anybody got my Halloween packet that I sent out, that was in there. You roast apples by the fire and you basically squeeze out the pulp and mix it with wine or with ale and serve it hot. So it's like mulled ale with this apple, this roasted, soft roasted apple pulp in it. That was another popular drink. Oh, Elizabeth, you are stumping me. I have heard of Hippocras. I think that's how it's pronounced. But I don't know that much about it. So we're going to Google it quick. Oh, so it's just another version of mulled wine. From where? Oh, it's just very old. Greek. Roman Empire. Okay, thank you. Not an expert in Roman foods. And the foods of antiquity. Basically, 18th century to the present tends to be more of my wheelhouse. But yes, very similar. Very similar. Basically, Europeans, if you had an alcohol, they like to put sugar and spices in it, particularly in the winter months. Sugar, interestingly enough, so a lot of recipes in antiquity focus on honey, in part because sugar is not native to Europe. It was not widely cultivated outside of India, which is where it originates. So when Europeans first got introduced to sugar, it was extraordinarily expensive, especially refined sugar, and it was treated as almost more of a spice. So people ate it very sparingly. And when sugar production was industrialized, and particularly once slavery was introduced in the Caribbean, sugar became much more widely available and much cheaper. So a lot of these traditional holiday beverages became more affordable and easier for people of ordinary means to consume, which is also true with the alcohol, because rum is not a byproduct. I guess it's an end product of the sugar refining process. Rum is primarily made from molasses. So that's when I say the Americans were using rum because it was cheaper and more available. It was cheaper and more available because of slavery. Fun history, right? All right, have we covered all of our medieval beverages? I think we have. But if you think of any others, you can drop them in the comments. And I'm gonna go back to fruitcake. So fruitcake also has its origins in medieval Europe. It comes out of the medieval great cakes tradition. So again, as I said, spices were expensive, sugar was expensive, particularly in Northern Europe. Dried fruits, raisins, currants, dried cherries, dried apricots. These were all quite expensive because those fruits do not flourish in Northern Europe. They're not native to Northern Europe. They have to be imported. And like sugar and spices and almonds and all of these other expensive ingredients, to be able to create a dessert that incorporates all of these very expensive ingredients was a very high status dessert. So the very wealthy in medieval Europe being able to serve an enormous, like I say they're great cakes because they were great cakes, they're huge, was a very high status dessert, much like, you know, a little bit later in the period, you know, Renaissance era, you start to get sugar-based confections, right, spun sugar, things like that, that continues into the 18th century. So a lot of the earliest of these types of recipes did use honey as a sweetener, but they kind of quickly graduated to sugar. And it's essentially a very dense cake of, which includes a lot of fruit, a lot of nuts, like it's jam-packed. You bake it weeks or even months in advance, and you pour distilled alcohol, you soak it in distilled alcohol, you wrap it, you let it age, and then at Christmas time is when you have it. So as these products became cheaper and more widely available, oh yeah, Anna Catherine, fruitcake is definitely conspicuous consumerism in medieval Europe, for sure. And also probably like how much dried fruit and nuts were in your fruitcake was indicative of your status, how sweet it was, for sure. If you had marzipan on top, that was also indicative. And these are not necessarily relegated just to Christmas. The simnel cake, sometimes also known as like the Mothering Sunday cake in Britain, is very similar. It's very dense, very rich, fruit-based cake with like a covering of marzipan, and then you have like the little balls of marzipan for the 12 apostles, right? This is not relegated to just Christmas. I did run across something that I now have to look up to make sure that I'm getting the facts right. What is it called? So traditionally in the Catholic calendar, a lot of feast days included fasting. And something occurs in the medieval period that's called the butter letter, and it's basically a dispensation from the Pope to be able to use butter at Christmas time. Which is pretty crazy to think about now, right? But that was definitely something that happened. Christmas is part of the medieval Catholic calendar, It was a feast day, but it was also a solemn holiday. We can get into the politics of religion about why early Christians didn't actually celebrate Christmas that close to the winter solstice. It has a lot to do with both Roman and pagan European celebrations around the winter solstice. But yes, you had to have special dispensation from the Pope in order to make dessert at Christmas, basically. So in the 19th century, because these ingredients start to get more ubiquitous, fruitcake does become more popular, and in the turn of the 20th century, like so many things, especially in the United States, fruitcake gets commercialized. And I have to tell everybody here that I have never had fruitcake ever in my life. I know it's kind of crazy. I've never had it. So when I was at the store the other day, they had a nice little display of all of the Christmas-related holiday treats. And I bought a little fruitcake from the Klaxon Fruitcake Company, which is based in Georgia, and has been making fruitcakes commercially since I think about 1913. And this is kind of the stereotypical American fruitcake that everybody likes to make fun of. So it's got candied citron in it. It's got red and green candied cherries, all kinds of giant walnuts. And I'm going to try it live on the air, Michael, so I won't be missing out much longer. So a lot of American fruitcake is not soaked in alcohol, which may or may not be a good thing. We'll see. I'm not impressed with the smell thus far, but we're gonna try some. I have this nice little plate and a little knife and fork, and I'm gonna cut myself a little slice. Now I do love dried and candied fruit. I'm not usually a fan of the red and green candied cherries just because I think they're like totally unnatural in color. Which they are quite unnatural, you guys. I don't know why we have to make cherries green. So that's my little slice of fruitcake. I don't know if you can see it. We're gonna try it. Anna Catherine says homemade is better. Homemade is definitely better, and making fruitcake, sorry, that was my leg. Making fruitcake is totally on my list because Anna Catherine, your family recipes sound amazing. But I thought for posterity, oh, it's quite sticky, that I should try it for Food History Happy Hour since we're talking about it. So here goes. I have to tell you, it tastes a little stale, which is disappointing. Because it's not supposed to expire until March. It might be the nuts. I do really enjoy citron, and this has a very forward citron flavor, which is the type of citrus fruit that is bitter and awful until you candy the peel. Yeah, I think the nuts might be a little stale, which is disappointing. But it's really, I don't know why people hate this so much. It's really not bad. It's basically just dried fruit, sticky dried fruit and nuts loosely held together with some batter and baked. So I guess if you don't like dried fruit and nuts, I could see why you wouldn't like this. But it's not bad. Okay, Annie's telling us a story. Hold on. Annie says, I have a letter from my great Aunt Ruby to my father, who was on Saipan during World War II. She was apologizing for his cake not reaching him in time for Christmas. She made the traditional black fruit cake. As she got older, her cakes got blacker and blacker. Probably because she was not as attentive to the timing of the cooking. Oh my god, that's so funny. Yes, there's black fruit cake and white fruit cake. Black fruit cake often has molasses in it. White fruit cake does not, it has sugar. But yeah, interesting. And then of course, Glenn has to bring up the classic Johnny Carson story that there's only one fruit cake in the world and everybody just keeps re-gifting it to someone else. Poor fruitcake. From medieval fashion to cultural laughingstock. I feel bad for it. Eggnog's still good, though. Alright, so that's fruitcake. I'm guessing that a homemade version would be better. Sorry, Klaxon Fruitcake Company. Some people love it. But I might have trouble eating that whole thing. If it was fresher, it might have tasted better. Anyway. What's my next one? So let's talk about plum pudding. So I don't know if you guys have seen, Netflix currently has the movie called The Man Who Invented Christmas that came out in 2017, which I watched, I believe, last year. And it's all about Charles Dickens, right? Who kind of, in many ways, invents what our modern concept of Christmas is with his book, The Christmas Carol. It's quite a fun little movie to watch. It's all about kind of how the book, The Christmas Carol, came about, which was mostly unplanned and kind of saved his family from ruin. So that's fun. But a lot of those older British Christmas traditions, right, that are based in medieval Europe make their way into The Christmas Carol, including some hot punch recipes. I think Flaming Bishop, Burning Bishop is mentioned. And of course, the infamous plum pudding. So, well, fruitcake is kind of like the dessert of the rich and famous in medieval Europe. Plum pudding is the more affordable version that makes its way onto the tables of more ordinary people. In large part because it has far fewer ingredients. The plums in the plum pudding are usually raisins or currants. And it's often boiled instead of being baked. So if you don't have access to a bake oven, which a lot of people did not in the time of open hearth cooking, it was much easier to boil something in a liquid, right? So boiled puddings, very traditional in the UK, kind of throughout their whole history. And in fact, pudding in modern British parlance has kind of come to mean any dessert, which I find interesting. But when you're boiling the pudding, basically, as it cooks, it expands, and you get this ball, right, of this kind of moist, extremely dense, fruit-studded thing that vaguely resembles fruitcake. And you'll see it in a lot of Victorian imagery. It's usually covered in a hard sauce, a white hard sauce, which is usually butter and sugar and, again, alcohol or wine poured over top. And then, of course, it hardens as it cools, right? And then a sprig of holly on top as decoration. Sometimes a flame, like you might pour brandy over it and set it on fire. But that is also kind of a lost Christmas tradition that people don't really do anymore. Toward the end of the 19th century, people did start steaming them in pudding molds. Sorry, that's Sweetie Pie making noise. Which was much fancier, of course. In Britain, we have to have everything in molds. Steaming also did make a slightly higher quality pudding. And they were not exclusively for Christmas. People made them year-round. But definitely the traditional plum pudding at Christmas, I think, in part becomes very associated with Christmas because of Charles Dickens, right? It's more middle-class dessert than fruitcake. The other one I want to talk about, because I realize I've already been talking for 45 minutes, is mincemeat. Mincemeat is something most people have never had. I think you occasionally see it, especially around the holidays on grocery store shelves, but it's in a jar usually. Sweetie, you're fine. You don't need to be whining right now. Sorry. Oh, Elizabeth is commenting. Yes, lots of people doing plum pudding videos. So if you want to see plum pudding kind of start to finish, definitely check them out. Elizabeth is mentioning Annie Gray and Kathy Hipperson of English Heritage and Max Miller of Tasting History. have done cooking videos describing how to make plum pudding. Alright, so she says one 18th century recipe calls for prunes or dried plums. So I don't understand why people stopped using them in puddings, but the name stuck. Probably because they weren't as widely available. That's all I can think of, but you rarely see dried plums in Victorian cookbooks, but raisins are everywhere. So it probably had to do with the commercialization of raisins. I don't know, I'd have to look up I'd have to look up how the raisin industry came to be about. Alright, so mincemeat is another medieval holdover, right? So in medieval Europe, the taste of food was quite different to how we think of food tastes today. And it was much more common to use sweet spices, things that we would consider sweet spices, in meat products. So mincemeat traditionally is minced, right? Cut up small. Beef or pork, depending on where you are. In Europe, in England, it was largely beef because the British love beef. Suet, which is a raw beef fat, and then raisins and other dried fruits, spices, sugar, and alcohol, usually brandy, right? And so you would make it in advance. You would let it rest for weeks or months so that it kind of ferments and the dried fruit absorb the alcohol. And then you would bake it in a pie. So in the 19th century, as people were kind of starting to understand, hey, maybe we shouldn't be consuming like a lot of leaving raw meat laying around, you do get sanitary mincemeat, which replaces the beef with apple. You still have the suet in there, right? But it replaces the beef with apple. And then even later, into the late 19th and early 20th century, in the United States, you also get some varieties of mincemeat that call for green tomatoes. So it's apples and green tomatoes and spices and raisins cooked in advance to thicken it up, and then you bake it in a pie afterwards. So, Anna Catherine said, sweetened suet just sounds like the most disgusting thing to me. So, because the British food chain, I guess you could say, is largely based on beef instead of pigs, as it comes to me in the United States, or instead of like geese, like it is in southern France, like a lot of cuisine is based on what fat is available. And in Britain, that's primarily beef fat. So tallow is rendered meat fat and suet is raw beef fat. And a lot of desserts in Britain use suet. So boiled puddings and steamed puddings use chopped suet. Roly-poly puddings was a pastry made with chopped suet. Mincemeat has chopped suet in it. It's like, you know, the less expensive version of butter. So if you couldn't afford to use a lot of butter and cook with a lot of butter, which kind of came from France, right? That's kind of a French influence in British cooking traditions. Butter-based pastry largely comes from France. Suet-based pastry is extraordinarily British, and it's quite stodgy in many ways. So I think that's kind of why it fell by the wayside. So I think mincemeat becomes lost, particularly the kind that contains actual meat, because people are kind of leery of letting raw meat just sit. It does end up being cooked once it's in the pie, but canning meat in particular, you have to do that in a specific way. And this is just the alcohol and the sugar acting as preservatives. They'd be stored in crocks, right, in a cool place, and the alcohol and the sugar are acting as preservatives for the meat. But also, tastes have changed in that most Americans and people living in Britain, and I would say largely Western Europe, don't really cook meat with those sweet spices anymore. There are obvious exceptions to that rule, but it's not as popular as it once was. And also we started, as sugar became more and more accessible, things got sweeter, right? So mince pie originally starts out as a savory pie, and the availability of sugar, it starts getting added at the medieval table, and then it kind of morphs into a dessert. But as things morph into dessert, we kind of move away from meat-based things and more toward fruit-based things. So, and I think in the United States, people think of mincemeat as, you know, like a not as good version of apple pie. Like, there's a surprising aversion to raisins in a lot of modern American palates that I find interesting. A lot of people hate raisins. I don't know why, but they do. So I think that has something to do with it. And a lot of these foods take a lot of time and advanced preparation to make, which as our Western life has industrialized, people are not spending as much time at home. They're not doing as much food preservation at home. So those sorts of foods that require a couple of weeks or a couple of months in order to be ready, we're just not patient enough for it. So you do get some commercial varieties. Like I said, you can buy jarred mincemeat. It's quite expensive. I think it's like $6 or $7 for a quart jar of it. You can purchase it. And a lot of people do at holidays because it's tradition, but it's really fallen out of favor for a lot of people. Okay, I'm missing some comments. Michael says, how about figgy pudding? How did I should have added this, you guys, to the thing. So figgy pudding obviously is very famous from the Christmas Carol, We Wish You a Merry Christmas. And I think Elizabeth is also talking about figgy pudding in the comments here. Yes, figgy pudding has figs, right? It's another kind of expensive imported Middle Eastern dried fruit, right? And I think figgy pudding is also like a boiled or steamed pudding, right? Pretty sure. Oh, wow. Wikipedia is saying something quite different. Interesting. Figgy pudding is apparently a catch-all term for a number of steamed or dense, rich, dried fruit-containing desserts. Okay, Anna Catherine says, why wasn't I born in the land of goose-based cuisine? There's a really excellent book called Garlic and Goose Fat about the goose fat-based cuisine of parts of southern France. I recommend it if you want to read it. But yes, what animal fat you're cooking with, or what fat you're cooking with in general, tends to inform a lot of cuisine. All right. Phew, that was a lot of talking, you guys. Do we have such great comments and questions? Does anybody else have any other questions before it's time to say goodbye? If you missed the first part of the show, I did make a single serve eggnog recipe from 1954. It is a jigger of spiced rum, a pony of bourbon, 1 whole egg, about a half cup of whole milk, a tablespoon of sugar. You shake it over ice, and then you put fresh nutmeg on top. Not super sweet, not super creamy. I prefer it to store-bought eggnog that doesn't contain alcohol. And it turned out pretty good. So if you don't want to use 12 eggs and a pound of sugar and pints of alcohol making a giant bowl of eggnog, this is the way to go. Very similar to a flip, but a flip does not include milk. Very similar to milk punch. Milk punch does not include eggs. So if you want to do your own eggnog, I do recommend it. You're taking your own health into your own hands, though, because there is always the risk of salmonella, so be sure to wash your eggs very well and never consume eggnog without alcohol. That includes raw eggs. That's my only recommendation. You can also purchase pasteurized eggs in some grocery stores, so feel free. All right. Anybody else with any other questions? Should I subject myself to another slice of fruitcake? Maybe it was just the end that was stale. We'll give it another little taste. I do really enjoy the flavor of citron, so That's what's making this nicer. The green cherries still weird me out, though. No, this is kind of stale. That's disappointing, you guys. Alright. Any last questions? Glenn says, I've always wondered how pudding changed from meaning something bready to something custardy. That's a very good question. So I think it might be one of those things where it's kind of a catch-all term. Oh, Elizabeth says quaking pudding was a sort of a custard. Yeah, I don't know when it stops being custard and starts being pudding. I have a feeling it's an Americanism. And maybe bread pudding is the gateway between custard-based puddings and steamed puddings. But yes, I think the custard-based, or really, by the end of the 19th century, the cornstarch-based pudding is more of an Americanism than it is used in other countries. Because it does definitely, yeah, custardy pudding's not the same. Let's see what the dictionary says. Oh, that's an interesting point. So a lot of sausages were originally considered puddings. Like haggis and blood sausage were puddings. It might have something to do with the texture. Because those are quite soft sausages, right? I don't know. It doesn't say. It doesn't say why it's different. But I think the British in general had a lot of terms that were sort of catch-all, which have come to evolve to mean very specific things. Like apple was originally just kind of a generic word for fruit, and corn was kind of just a generic word for grain. So maybe pudding was just a generic word for soft things that you eat. I don't know. Good question. Sorry I couldn't answer it. Alright. Any other questions, comments, personal anecdotes, holiday stories? I am gonna maybe be baking some Christmas cookies soon because I said I would mail them to people and Christmas is getting closer. So that's probably what I'm gonna be doing. Some of you are already Patreon patrons. And if you want to join before the end of the month, I am sending out holiday cards to all my Patreon patrons with some cookie recipes in there. So if anybody wants to join, you can look me up on Patreon. Oh, Anna Catherine is saying, can we have a haggis and Scotch history happy hour for Burns Day in January? I'm not Scottish. So I don't have the same affection for Burns Day that I think a lot of Scots do. I do know people who actually celebrate it, like, in real life. I never have. I don't think haggis is as disgusting, I think, as a lot of people say. It's just a sausage. I would try haggis. I don't know that I would special order it, Anna Catherine. But send me the link and I'll see. No promises, because also January is my birthday month. And I'm not sure I want to have haggis for my birthday month. But we'll see. We'll see. Oh, Elizabeth also requests a 12th night cake celebration in January. So January also, just very quickly before we're done here, is like, so my ethnic celebration in January is Sugardag Knut, which is the 20th day of Knut. Which is like when King Knut of the ancient Swedes basically told them they had to stop celebrating Christmas. So that's, you make split pea soup, dance around the Christmas tree, eat up the rest of your Christmas goodies, and throw it out in the snow. So maybe we'll have a conglomerate food history happy hour in January that's about all of those things. Alright everybody, my hour is just about up, so I'm going to say goodnight. Thank you so much everybody for joining us. And we will see you next year. All right? Good night.